I'm Phil Tierney from Chester, Connecticut. You are listening to ICRV Radio, the stream feeding the River Valley.
Welcome, everybody, to a special event on ICRV Radio, the first ever episode of Archaeology of Connecticut. And this is something that has taken a while and just a little bit of planning to get all the right figures around the round table. And we're kicking off with some of the brightest minds and most passionate participants in the field of archaeology in our state. And it's just a treat for us to be able to launch into this program on ICRV Radio. Kind of heading things around the round table is the state archaeologist, Brian Jones. Brian, welcome to ICRV Radio.
Hi, David. Thanks so much for having us here. I think we'll start with some introductions. So let me just say, my name is Brian Jones again, and I am the state archaeologist. And as a state archaeologist, I kind of wear many hats, but one of them is to make sure that the archaeology of Connecticut, the ideas and just the excitement about archaeology in Connecticut gets out to everyone in the state. So I was so pleased that you came to us, and I think it was through our friends organization, POSA, which we'll be talking about.
Exactly.
That I was reached, and this is a perfect venue, one of the best ways to reach a lot of people at one time. I give a lot of talks around the state, and sometimes you get a room of 30, sometimes 100, sometimes 4. But so this is really a great way to discuss the archaeology of the state, which is an exciting archaeology, as we'll get into, and just really get into some of the themes that I think are really important. So potentially we've got shows to take us through over a year if we can do this once a month. So hopefully we'll kind of pull it all together and have lots to talk about, and hope really get everybody out there in the public informed about Connecticut archaeology.
And it's a way for us to use a specific dig event or use a specific artifact as a way of kind of going on a journey, a centuries-long journey, and understanding a little bit about the evolution of the landscape, both literally and figuratively, of our state.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that's exciting about Connecticut has been through many dynamic changes, environmentally, climatically, over the last, let's just say, limited for now to say 13,000 years or so, which is when at least archaeologists say people have been here and colonized Connecticut. If you talk to Native American people, some of them will say they have been here potentially longer than that. So, we'll bring in some of those perspectives as well, I hope. But why don't we say, let's see, some of the roles that I have. Let me just kind of briefly get into.
Well, can I jump in and ask you, is it unusual for a state to have a state archaeologist? Are we unique as a state to have such a position?
Not really. Most states have a state archaeologist. It's really about where that individual is housed. Connecticut is somewhat unique in having the state archaeologist be up at the University of Connecticut. Most state archaeologists are associated with what's called the State Historic Preservation Office. And we have that up in Hartford. It's a very important organization. They manage a lot of historic preservation issues, and we will hopefully have a whole talk devoted to what the SHPO is, the State Historic Preservation Office. It is a challenging work environment, I'm going to say. There's a lot of pressure. It's basically a cubicle job. And so I feel very lucky to be at UConn, where I can work directly with students and have a lot of opportunities to deal with the public, again, more easily and more directly, and also run my own field schools in the summer for the public. That's something that really wouldn't happen if I was stuck in the Historic Preservation Office. So
you have a lot going on. Tell us all the different things that you're involved in.
Yeah, like I said, I do have to wear a lot of hats. So on the one level, part of my job involves the review of construction projects at the municipal level, that is for each town. Now, we don't have that many towns in the state that actually have regulations that require my review. I would say there's about 40. And
only 40 out of 169 towns.
169, so that's something I need to work on. And I would say even of that 40, there may only be about 20 that are really actively acting on that. They may not be aware that they have these regulations that were put in place, say, 30 years ago. So that's part of what I do. I have to admit, if if I had every state on board and doing the regulations, which is really the goal because we want to protect sites from private construction, and that sometimes is even these big box stores. So it's not state or federal projects, but local developments happening that often don't fall under the same kind of state and federal rules that kind of kick in archaeology under those circumstances. So it's tricky, but were I to get 169 towns involved with that, that's probably all I would do. And again, that would turn into my cubicle job, right? So in a way, I'm a little hesitant, but again, the goal is to make sure those sites are protected. That's something I'm mandated to do, so it's very important. But again, for me, the most exciting part of the job is to work with the public and get them enthusiastic about archaeology, which is why I run a number of, I call them kind of mini field schools in the summer. So traditionally, there was one run for adults through the Connecticut State Museum of Natural History for a week. And I've kind of expanded on those to include one for teachers, educators, generally at the high school but middle school levels, especially those we're focused on, hopefully, teaching history to kids, to give the teachers a chance to get sort of hands-on experience with archaeology and share the enthusiasm of archaeology with their kids. So again, one of my goals is to reach a few people that way, and hopefully their experiences will go out to hundreds of kids. We started one last year for vets and active service members, and that's one I'm really excited to continue. We kind of started off with a fairly small but really great group last summer, and I think we're going to grow that program as the word gets out about it. That one I actually run for free so that they can take part, but it'll be limited in terms of how many people can do it because it can get kind of crowded on a site sometimes. Yeah. UConn also runs a kids archaeology program for a week, so that's, again, something that I'm a little bit more directly in charge of these days. And then finally, we have the Friends organization, FOSA, the Friends of the Office of State Archaeology. I've given them a kind of week of their own as a field school to make sure they're getting trained in proper archaeological methods. And because, in a way, I think FOSA used to, and we'll have some perspective from Gary and Don, kind of take a little bit more active role in running around the state and helping the state archaeologists do a lot of excavation themselves. I have tried to shift that increasingly to contract archaeologists, the professionals out there. So partly to reduce my burden, because I can't do it on my own. It's also not ethical. I can't review projects and then go do the work, and I wouldn't be getting paid for it anyway. So we've shifted away a little bit from some of that hands-on archaeology that the FOSA members often join the group for. And that's why I want to make sure they've got at least 1 week of good hands-on, really cool archaeology that they can do. Like we've been working on this 17th century site in Glastonbury. Awesome site. So we can get into that one a little bit more later, perhaps. And again, so I'm up at UConn, so I work with students. I've got grad students that I work often with. We've got right now like an undergrad history major. We're helping us in the collections. I'm also in charge of all the archaeological and ethnographic collections up at UConn, so that's another big part of my responsibility that I want to definitely take care of. So, a lot of different hats to wear, but this is the fun one, getting out and talking to everybody about archaeology.
Well, you've brought some great enthusiasts to round out the round table a little bit. One we're used to seeing with an atlatl, and one we're used to seeing with Christmas wreaths. But anyway, shall we go around and get to know Gary Nolf? Gary, welcome.
Hi there. I want to start by saying that I've worked with the state archaeologists for going on at least 25 years now. And about 22 years ago, two of the members that would volunteer with Nick Malantoni, who was the state archaeologist at the time, Dave Cook and June Cook, decided that the state archaeologist needed some help. He doesn't have a paid staff. And he relies on people to help him throughout the state. And so we decided we would form a group, and we started with approximately 10 people. And I was fortunate enough to be the first president of the group. Now we're in the hundreds, and we've been in existence for about 22 years now.
That's such a great story.
And
what is it, Gary, that gets people excited? I mean, what is it that is responsible for that kind of growth and longevity?
Well, one thing is that people really just don't realize how many things we have, how much the history is in this state. And when they find out, they're amazed. It's just fantastic to see the enthusiasm. You know, Don and I have started the Archaeology Roadshow in Connecticut, where it's devoted to educating people about the archaeology of Connecticut. We've started archaeology groups in a couple of high schools. We do. I do a lot of demonstrations with the atlatl, and people don't even know what that is. But when they get a chance to try it, they are just amazed. So we have a lot of fun doing it, and it just helps out. I did a couple of three elementary schools last fall, and the teachers, the reason that they got involved was because they saw us at one of the archaeology roadshows. And they said, oh, well, we need to talk about this and present this kind of material to the kids. And so if we start them young, hopefully as they get older, they're going to be understanding the right things about what happened here in Connecticut.
Don, what is it about digging up our past that connects with you?
Well, first of all, before I get into that, I want to say that my first connection, I think like with Gary, was with Nick Bellantoni. And Nick would come down to Manhasset, and we would hike in, part of the land trust where they have those Indian rock shelters. And that's, so I observed Nick, and he had the trowel in his back pocket, and we'd come up to one of those cave things. He'd be poking around, and he'd pluck out one of these quartz chips, and he said, look at this. This is evidence of tool making and all that. And I was still practicing medicine at the time. I said, wow, isn't this fascinating? Okay, so whenever I could, and Nick was very generous with his time coming down to the shoreline, I would show up as best I could. Fast forward until finally I retired, and then I got involved with the Hammonasset Festival, co-created that with Dale Carson to really educate folks about Native American culture. We brought in a lot of Native American performers and so on. So I was always interested in Native American culture. So the payoff for me, and Gary and I would be working at a rock shelter, say the one in, is it Deep River?
Killingworth.
It's in Killingworth, but very close to the Deep River line. It's just south of Route 8's water company property. And the payoff for me would be to take time out and just sit on the side of the cave or sit on a boulder and just try to image what it was that these people were doing there and what was their life like? What was their family unit like? Did they have any games that they played? What would have been their conversations? I found those kinds of things just fascinating to think about. And I think from the broad perspective of archaeology, it's fun to discover stuff. It's just, and that's like being a little kid again. You're screening stuff and you finally find something of value. But I think the real value from my perspective is taking a look at particularly Native American culture and saying, what is it that we can learn from this early culture that we can apply in today's world? And for my money, it's a lot. So as we know about Native American culture, women could be leaders. They could be sachems. Elders were treated with a great deal of respect. They weren't just shunted off to some nursing home or anything, and they were held in high regard. Children were treated with the highest level of respect and honor. They were never physically punished, or rarely so. In fact, when Native Americans observed the English physically punishing the children, it was a no-no for Native Americans. So all these things, I think, are great values for contemporary society. But actually, this is Brian. Oh, I want to say, so Brian, you took over like 4 years ago? Or?
Yeah, we're working closer to 5 soon.
Closer to 5. That's really hard to believe. But, I have to say, and I think, Gary, you'd agree with me, when Nick retired, we didn't know what was going to happen. And I think, Brian, you were one of several candidates, and I think Foles had a chance to weigh in. And, Brian, I'm just so delighted that you were selected and that you're leading the band, because Gary and I are supportive to what you do. And I just love your enthusiasm, and I'm just a supportive person. I mean, I carry the instruments for the band. I think that's the way I look at it.
You got roadies here.
Yeah. Well, and guys like Don have provided incredible financial support as well to my office. And, as Gary mentioned, I don't have staff. I have a tiny budget now that I begged for when I started the job. That was one of the new things I did. So it allows me to pay for some field equipment and some travel around the state, and sometimes even to get out to a conference nationally. But it does not pay for things like the analysis of the artifacts that we find, and that is absolutely critical to understanding what we're doing. It's really what separates us from, just finding cool treasure, right? We want to analyze, we want to understand. So even the things like analyzing plant remains from a site, burned plant remains, these are little tiny pieces of just burnt charcoaly bits. But it costs thousands of dollars, for even handfuls of samples to get really appropriately analyzed. So this is where, Don has come in, provided a lot of money, and I really, really appreciate that. So it's huge. It's like without the support, is basically many FOSA members kick in. We get radiocarbon dates paid for students working around the state and things like that as well. So that's really terrific. I couldn't do it myself. Absolutely not.
Because Brian, can't you learn as much from applying new technology to existing finds versus new finds?
Yeah, in a way, we are overwhelmed with our collections, right? Like every repository around the country and frankly around the world, there's just too much stuff in there. We don't have enough people to examine it, let alone sort of take care of it all appropriately. So there's a huge amount of data. And there has been a shift in research, and even the funding for research is shifting towards examining these older collections. So, yeah, the kind of material, say, that Kevin McBride was digging out of say, South Windsor Meadows in 1974 or 76 at Woodchuck Knoll, those are, he did a little analysis at the time. He was taking classes on his own, trying to understand what the botanicals he was finding, those little plant remains were. But were we to kind of pass that off to a professional right now to really spend, weeks and weeks of time on, we would get an incredible amount of new information on that site, which was basically 4,000 years old. It would be really critical to know that. So
you started at the top saying that, by all interests, that it's really, we're talking about 13,000 years ish. That we're, that's the arc of the journey, as it were, right? Do you break that down into periods?
Yeah. So archaeologists kind of do divide that long period of history into chunks. So we talk first about the Paleo-Indian period, and that basically covers a time, basically it's during the Ice Age. And so for us, we're talking about at least 13,000 years ago to 10,000 years ago. And this is where it gets tricky because those are radiocarbon years. And if you change the 10,000 years ago, it's actually closer to, 11,500 years ago. So we won't worry about that right now. But during the Ice Age, you've got the Paleo-Indian period. And so these are people living in a very, very different environment. They're hunting caribou, for example. They're probably fishing. They're probably hunting seal. There's a lot of things we just don't know yet about them because the sites we have found so far are very small. They don't tend to have a lot of preserved plant or animal remains associated. So we kind of have to compare sites from all around the eastern region, even looking out west at what people are doing to kind of understand it better and understand the technological traditions that they're coming out of. And after that, we get into what we call the Archaic period. And that's the era of the development of our sort of modern, warmer period and forested climate. And so that is covering basically the period of hunting and gathering peoples pretty much before the use of pottery. At the very end of this period, you run into a time where they start making soapstone bowls by about 3,500 to 3,000 years ago. But pottery doesn't come around until 3,000 years ago, and that, for archaeologists, marks the beginning of what we call the woodland period. These are just arbitrary names that have been just sort of anchored in the literature. And the woodland period it's all these different things. The Archaic and the woodland are divided into early, middle, late, and terminal, and it gets kind of crazy, right? And that's why you go to school and study this stuff. But the woodland period goes up to the time of contact basically with Europeans who start arriving here, arguably in the 1500s, so we know very little about that. But certainly more into the early 1600s, especially in Connecticut. Things don't really kick off till about 1630. So then we get into what we call the contact period, if you're studying, and that term is used primarily for the study of native archaeology, and it's really focused on understanding how Native Americans adapted and dealt with the arrival of these new people and the diseases that they brought and things like that. A lot of challenges and their sort of coping mechanisms and the strategies they used to survive and make sure their families thrived. And they did, as we know, because Native people are among us today. So after that, we kind of then just get into the historical archaeological period, and we tend to use that more when we're talking about people of European ancestry. But that can include, African-American archaeology, gets into early industrial archaeology, and even the archaeology that covers things like the Cold War. So some of our most recent archaeological preserves that's sort of a system set up in the state to protect important archaeological sites. Includes one from the Cold War, a Nike missile site that's kind of on the Portland-Glastonbury border. So we really cover the gamut. Arguably, we're really focused on stuff up to about 50 years old. So that gets me in there.
Gets us all in there. The whole table.
Yeah, I think we're all well covered. So so that really, and as time moves forward, things into the 60s start to become sort of more important archaeologically.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, of these 5 periods, which is the most robust in terms of meat on the bone for the state of Connecticut?
Well, in terms of, so archaeologists are interested in material culture. That means stuff, right? And if we're going to look at it just in sheer numbers, the archaeology of the time period post-dating about the Revolutionary War is most abundant with stuff. We're entering a mass production economy, a mass consumption economy. It's a kind of throwaway economy already by the 1780s. We don't think of that. We think that's a long time ago, but trust me, they're dumping stuff. And frankly, it's one of the reasons I avoid those sites like the plague. It is too much effort to make sure that the lab work happens to get all that stuff properly inventoried. It's an incredible burden. And because there's so many sites from that period too on, and though people get excited, well, this is like, just around the Revolutionary War time or the early 1800s, you can go to Sturbridge and kind of see day-to-day life, and it's cool. But there's a lot of examples of that out there. So one of the things we have to do as archaeologists is to decide which sites are really important, which are significant to really understanding important events in the past, important individuals or families, or importantly, too, the way the common person lived that may not be very well documented. So therefore, were we in Connecticut to find, an important African-American site from a free black family living in, the mid-1700s, we have some actually that date to the 1690s in this state. It would be very interesting to look at those farmsteads, right? They haven't been excavated yet, but that would be critical information. We don't have that very well documented. So, we'll probably devote a show to African-American archaeology down the road, too. So any kind of sort of disenfranchised and poorly documented people are the groups that archaeologists want to focus on, because we use archaeology to better understand people's daily lives, especially when they haven't been well represented in the historical record.
And through the course, you've written out, kind of framed out guidelines on future episodes. Do you want to kind of cover a little bit of the topics that we're gonna get into over the course of the next several months?
Sure. Let's. This is kind of the draft or wish list at this point. But I want to run through about the first half of these programs chronologically, and then we'll start getting into some sort of themes in the archaeology of the state. So I want to start hopefully next month with a discussion of the Templeton site in Washington, Connecticut, and the Paleo-Indian period in general. So we'll have a couple specialists who've worked on that site and others here at the table. After that, I want to talk about the early Archaic period and how people adapted to the changing climate at the end of the Ice Age. We talk about climate change today a lot and how we're going to deal with it and manage. The truth is, people between 10,000 and 9,000 years ago were living a period of really dramatic environmental change, and the way they coped was sometimes really interesting. There have been some very interesting new sites found in Connecticut in the last, 20 years, right? And so hopefully we'll get a chance to discuss some of those. Afterwards, the next show, I would like to deal with the rest of the Archaic period. That's the middle and late and terminal Archaic periods a bit. And we'll have some folks on board who have really done their own research on that period. We may even just devote a special one to soapstone quarries. And that's one of my ways to get, hopefully we'll get Kenny Fader out here. He's a ball. If we can get him on the radio and have him start talking, we'll have a very active show, I think. But Connecticut's interesting in that it has these soapstone outcrops and sometimes boulders that have been ripped glacially from their sort of bedrock sources and then utilized by people to make these stone objects. Later, we'll find that they make pipes out of the same soapstone material, but in the beginning, about 3,000 years ago in particular, they're making these large bowls. And it raises questions. You're making a giant 20 or 30-pound bowl. What does that say about your mobility on the landscape? What kind of foods are you eating? How are you using them to process food? So there's a lot we can talk about, even just with soapstone quarries and bowls. I'd like to then jump into the late woodland period and talk about the Morgan site. That's in Rocky Hill, Connecticut, a really important village site that really has not been, I don't want to say this too judgmentally, but really hasn't been professionally excavated, but there were rescue excavations done by sort of hobbyist archaeologists in the 80s and then again in the 90s. And the Office of State Archaeology was always a little bit peripherally involved with both of those excavations, but it is one of the richest and most important sites in the state. And I have, I think, a couple hundred boxes of material from that one site that still needs a lot of work and processing. But there's a lot we can talk about there in terms of sort of village life around 1300, 1400 AD in the state and how that's developing. It's a very interesting story. Again, this is the time when people really focused on maize horticulture, but it's a very diverse economy and diet, a lot of deer, a lot of fish, and things like that. So, and things like also that site is well known for the manufacture of clay pipes, for example. So what are the role of pipes and smoking in native culture, too? That's things like that should come out. And hopefully from there we will actually, I'd like to do a show, if we can get everybody on board, to have some Native American perspectives on archaeology in the state.
Yeah.
It's a chance for folks from the Native community to kind of air their opinions and concerns and ideas about the archaeology and the peopling of the area. And it's a chance even to discuss, hopefully pretty openly, some of the conflict and challenges that have existed between archaeologists and Native people, because sometimes perspectives are very different on the past. And sometimes, Native people feel like they've been taken advantage of or that their history has been co-opted from them. So I think it's really important we'll get some Native folks on the table to talk about that.
That is going to be fantastic.
Yeah, so we'll make sure that we get that to work. And we're already talking 8 shows from now, but we'll
moving right along.
Yeah, so I'm not going to run through this entire list, but maybe we'll go through the first 10 or so. I really want to talk, I'm very excited to talk about the 17th century. And here I want to get Kevin McBride on to talk about the Pequot War and the work he's been doing. Amazing studies happening there, but we've had great finds. One of the sites I've been working on is the Hollister site in Glastonbury, Connecticut, a kind of mid to late 17th century farmstead, but a massive farm complex. Tremendous archaeology, a lot of architectural features, cellars that we're finding, and a huge amount of just data coming out of that site. That doesn't sound exciting, right? Data. But it is just amazing, cool stuff, amazing pottery, amazing food remains. We know basically everything that they ate because it was thrown away and burnt and it's left on the site. I can tell you all about their diet already. Amazing. But other good work has been going on in Wethersfield. You mentioned Webdean Stevens. You had a chance to work there?
I did. Yes, it was really just one of the highlights of my life. Yeah, just for a few hours, but it was fantastic.
So the work at that site by archaeological, actually, I think it's their nonprofit branch, the Public Archaeology Survey team that's been working there because they want to do an educational expansion to the building. And by chance, they hit a buried 17th century artifact horizon that may date really to the 1630s, 1640s, quite early on. They're finding wampum and just an amazing site, a great context. Very clean and it's just sort of nicely layered too, because above the 17th century material, you get some nice early 18th century stuff, and then you kind of work your way towards the American Revolutionary War, all the way up into the early 20th century, and there's dumps there that were just littered with bottles and things. Did you see some
fully
of that?
Intact. Yes, I sure did. Yeah, completely intact.
The object I was most excited by, and this is kind of goofy, but they had a complete tankard, like a nice German Bierstein, and I think it just said Prost on it. And it's interesting, because in the context, I think they realized that was probably tossed out into that dump area maybe right around the time of World War I. So because why are you going to throw away a perfectly good Bierstein? I was like, I could use that. It was, I'd never seen an artifact so intact.
Brian, has it been confirmed, accepted that there was a palisade or parts of a palisade that was found at that dig, and that has caused people to kind of rethink the physical landscape of how some of these settlements actually were set up?
Yeah, it's tricky, and we'll have Ross Harper on, hopefully, to talk about that in a little bit more detail. What they have is a sort of a trench stain. In other words, there's stained ground at the level of 17th century material. It goes down into the ground a little bit, 6-8 inches. So it is some kind of line, a trench that was dug into the ground, and in some places they can see posts were shoved into it. So the question is really what it was. And I think Ross uses the term palisade, and sometimes that sounds like a giant Western stockade fort to people, right? But this may be something a little bit simpler, like a fence around the outer wall of the house, partly to keep even pigs in, keep pigs out if you're growing your vegetables. But it could have been a defensive structure as well. And those are kind of some of the mysteries there, because they haven't really figured out where the house itself was. They know they're very close to it. They're right on the corner of the existing 18th century structure there, right? So they don't know exactly where the 17th century house was, but there's so much debris coming, and they know they're quite close to it. So exactly how these trench features tie in to the house structures remains a mystery. It's going to be really interesting. I think they're going to go back and do more work, so hopefully we'll learn more. And then I think we'll just say after that we'll get into, to kind of wrap up the chronological themes, we'll hit 18th century household archaeology. And again, we'll have some specialists like Ross Harper and Sarah Sportman who have worked on a number of those to really kind of explain what life was like in the 1700s. And, yes, it's the colonial period. I often run into problems where people talk about the 1800s as the colonial period, but no, it was done. We were Americans, right? But this is truly the colonial period, but we're out of the 17th century where it's really life on the frontier, right? And so how did people adapt? How rich were their lives in terms of material culture? What we do see is a lot of recycling of goods. So they were very thrifty people, let's put it that way. And these values really get ingrained in Yankee culture. And it's something we see kind of codified by the late 18th century into the 19th century in books and things written about how you should behave and how you should run your household economy.
We have so much more to cover and get into, and we look forward to doing that. But let's just take a pause in the action. We'll be back with more Archaeology of Connecticut right after this.
It takes a community to improve the quality of life for all. Neighbors and friends who generously give their time and resources to support a passion or area of interest. Hi, I'm Cynthia Clegg of the Community Foundation of Middlesex County, a nonprofit organization that connects worthy causes and valued donors to address the important work of helping others. Thanks to you, we're able to make even the smallest gift have a big impact through charitable funds that support the arts, animal welfare, human services, education, the environment, heritage enhancement, and so much more. Together, we are able to make a real difference in the lives of so many by providing a way for donors to target gifts so they can do maximum good, and by providing grants, support services, and programs to our local nonprofits. We celebrate all of you who share the same desire to work in partnership to help our local community thrive today and tomorrow. Learn more by visiting us online at middlesexcountycf.org or by calling us at 860-347-0025. Live local, give local at the Community Foundation of Middlesex County. Thank you.
This is Southern New England. No matter where you find yourself, you're only 15 or 20 minutes away from a state park, a wild space, a hiking trail. Adventure is calling. Denali is here to help you find it. Denali stores meet the region's outdoor, athletic, and lifestyle needs, with gear for hiking, running, climbing, travel, camping, and more, from top brands like Patagonia, The North Face, Merrell, Yeti, and UGG. You'll discover eco-friendly apparel made with organic cottons and recycled polyesters, and you'll find gear and equipment for all of your outdoor needs. Hosting cleanups and travel talks, supporting youth organizations and environmental programs. With our community partners, we preserve and protect access to green spaces, creating opportunities for all children to experience and enjoy the outdoors. We are your friends and neighbors, and Denali celebrates the outdoors we know and love. Our staff are world travelers, local leaders, and experts in the outdoor industry, uniquely qualified to get you out on the trails and ready for a day at the beach. Experience Denali at 75 Main Street in Old Saybrook, or also in Brantford, Trumbull, Mohegan Sun, and online at denalioutdoor.com.
Welcome back to Archaeology of Connecticut and our state archaeologist, Brian Jones.
All right, I guess while we've got a little time left, what I thought I wanted to do this show is kind of dive into some important themes. Mostly, let's hit on the Native American archaeology first, because that's going to be covering the upcoming shows. There's some important themes I have in mind, too, for historical archaeology. But let's just kind of dive into the first five. And this is sort of based on, actually, a paper I first wrote in, I think, the mid-2000s, and then a talk that I've been giving around the state whenever I can. So that talk is called, 5 Things Everyone Should Know About the Native American History or Archaeology of Connecticut. And I try to break it down into these sort of 5 kind of big ideas to kind of organize what are otherwise a pretty unwieldy number of concepts, I think. And so this, I hope, helps students, but also the general public understand some of the most important things that I think of it when I think about the archaeology of the state. And in a way, it's getting into some of these sort of questions we ask academically, but really I think they're broader questions that I think the public can really appreciate. So the first of these is what I consider the true colonization of Connecticut. So, when we think of the colonization, we think of these English folks coming in here, but we have to remind ourselves that far longer ago, 13,000 years ago, Native American people moved into Connecticut and very, very successfully settled in here and started raising families and increased their numbers rapidly. And before we knew it, we had folks up in Maine and Nova Scotia. And they were well settled in here within a couple hundred years, basically a few generations. So a very, very successful colonization event. We could judge that at the global level. We see sort of colonizers moving all around the planet, place to place. Now, these aren't colonizers in the sense of they're taking advantage of the resources or local individuals. These are the people who were just first arrived. So we're going to use that term for that. We'll kind of discuss this in more detail, I think, when we talk about Paleo-Indians next time. But some of the things to keep in mind, one is we really want to know the process, like how did people get here? Did they arrive in like a single family group, or did they come as a whole group of 200 people en masse and sort of settle into one valley? And so those are the kind of questions we like to kind of tease apart. And it's challenging because archaeologically we don't have a lot of sites to use to pull data from to understand that. So sometimes we have to fall back on kind of anthropological theory and understanding migration theory and things like that. And just understanding the human animal. What is it? How many people do you need to maintain a population? And a lot of the rules are you need about 500 or minimally 200 people if you're a large mammal to keep going, to reproduce and stay in an environment for a while. So the second big theme is that adaptation to the sort of post-glacial climate, the rapid changes that happened at the end of the Ice Age. How did people cope? How did they manage? Often these changes were probably, you could see them within a generation, if not maybe even a decade or so. You might be noticing changes in the climate. So your food base is changing very quickly. How did people adapt in Connecticut? And this is it's a global question because we see this, it's the Mesolithic period in Europe. But all around the world, we see people adapting to this change in climate. Now, in the Near East, for example, you're shifting from the glacial conditions there caused aridity, but what you see happening is the beginnings of the Neolithic culture. That is, people starting to plant foods and domesticate crops and animals. And in Asia, you see the development of pottery at a very early time, suggesting they're sort of starting to more intensively process and food and things. So all around the world, we see important changes happening 10,000 years ago. So what did that look like here in Connecticut as well? We do see some very interesting things happening, some much more complex behavior than we would have expected, say, 20 or 30 years ago, based on the ideas back then. I also then like to jump ahead to about 3,500 years ago, dealing with the terminal archaic period, where we see the development of really complex exchange systems. And that is, goods are moving across the landscape. They're actually often ending up in burial contexts, but sometimes on domestic sites as well. And we need to explain that. Why did people feel it necessary to start acquiring goods from a distance? What did it mean? What does it tell us about sort of the development of status and rank in society? And so these are, one of the to give some of this away, one of my ideas behind this is I think that it was a way of mitigating or lessening violence between communities that may have been happening because of population increase that was occurring at this time. So one of the ways to basically keep good relations with your neighbors is to take part in these sort of formalized exchange ceremonies. Often they were probably quite ceremonial in nature. So around 3,000 years ago, then we get into the next core concept, and that's sort of changes in foodways and the need basically to get more food out of the environment to feed more people. And as we've already hinted at, we see the development of the stone bowls and very quickly thereafter pottery. And, I like to tell people sort of pottery, I don't see that as sort of a light bulb going off and say, oh, I just thought of a great way to make something. I think people would have always known how to do this, but there comes a point in time where it's more practical and more important and maybe even necessary to make pottery. It's challenging to make pottery well, and it does take a certain amount of skill and practice. And so what happens in the culture that really requires it, and I would argue one of the things is they needed to get more nutrients out of smaller and smaller areas of land, which means you need more complex food processing technologies, and that's what pots are. And then finally, there's really important questions in Connecticut that rise about sort of social and political complexity. We kind of know we had sachems, and I think Don was talking about sachems and female sachems and things like that too. But what was the role of the sachem? When did that develop? How far back can we push that into sort of the pre-contact period? What I find myself saying is prehistoric, and I'll say right now that is a term that most Native people really dislike strongly. So, I tend to make my best effort not to use the word prehistoric. Archaeologists use the term very loosely to mean any peoples around the planet who haven't left a written record. But when you're talking about people from that culture, they can sort of take offense to that because they say we have a perfectly good history. It's just oral tradition, right? Right. So, out of respect to that, we try not to say prehistoric too often. But I think there's interesting things in the archaeology of Connecticut to tell a story that may discuss the rise of individual leadership and power about 2,500 years ago. And that kind of seems to disappear archaeologically. And I kind of wonder what happens. And I think what we're left with is, instead of a centralized power like we see a little bit among the Iroquois, but especially as you get into these Mississippian societies occurring at the same time in the Midwest, where there is human sacrifice and things like that, really overt power over individuals happening. I think there's kind of a rebellion against that among Algonquin communities in our region. This is a suspicion I have, and it's pretty challenging to prove that archaeologically. But we definitely see this idea of the sachem going through time into the contact period. And sachems had a lot of privileges. They could often have multiple wives. They're providing feasts for people. They're providing, leadership for the community, but there's limitations on their control over the population as well. So people can still kind of vote with their feet if they don't like the idea. And if, decisions about, say, going to war are usually much more consensus-based. One individual can't force everyone to, say, take up arms. So that leaves us with interesting things to kind of try to explain and talk about, I think.
I listened to that breakdown, and Don, I go back to your comment about how the journey allows us to learn so much that we can apply to today's times, especially when you're talking about, the getting used to post-glacial era and the climate changes, and especially as we're talking about the need to come up with different ways of getting more food or different food sources. I mean, there is so much of what you